Dust swirled in the narrow street, curling around boots and wagon wheels as if the wind itself wanted to drag the life out of the place. Margaret Hale stumbled forward, her arms wrapped protectively around the swaddled weight of her newborn. Her legs trembled. Her breath came in ragged bursts. But she stayed upright because falling meant they would kick her while she was down. Her late husband's kin stood in a half-circle behind her, voices sharp as burrs, hands pushing her until she nearly lost her balance. "She's cursed," one of them spat. 3 girls and not a son. What good's a woman like that? The baby whimpered against her breast and Margaret adjusted her grip, hiding the child's face from the dust and from their stares. She could feel her older daughter's eyes. From the doorway where they'd been ordered to stay, they would remember this. Shame, the cold. The townsfolk didn't intervene. They stood like fence posts unmoving, weather-beaten, eyes fixed on the scene with that familiar, resigned distance. This was not the first cruelty they'd seen in this place, and it would not be the last. The sound of hooves cut through the wind. A large bay horse came into view, its rider straight-backed and wrapped in a dark coat that seemed to swallow the daylight. Jonas Cutter. She knew the name before she'd ever spoken it. Everyone did. A man who lived miles out past the cottonwoods, who rarely came to town unless supplies forced him. He didn't slow as he drew alongside her, but his eyes deep set beneath the brim of his hat took in the scene with a single sweep. It was no visible anger, no dramatic shift in his expression, just a quiet, measured awareness. It's like a man looking at whether he'd already decided how to ride through. "You're coming with me," he said. The voice was low, carrying over the wind. Without force, but something in its steadiness made her kin fall silent. Before she could find her own voice, Jonas was off the horse, lifting her by the arm in a way that was firm without hurting. She smelled leather, cold air, and faint smoke from his coat. Margaret didn't protest. She couldn't. She was too tired, too aware of the baby's tiny breaths, too certain that staying meant more than bruises. He swung her up into the saddle. As if she weighed no more than the blanket in her arms, the horse shifted, hooves thudding against the packed earth, but Jonas's hand on the reins stilled him. Without another word to anyone, he mounted behind her, the length of his coat falling around her sides like a shield. They rode out under a sky the color of old tin. The wind bit at her cheeks, catching strands of hair that had fallen loose from her braid. Jonas didn't speak, and she didn't dare ask why he'd stepped in. The only sound was the creak of leather and the rhythmic strike of hooves. The land opened up beyond the last of the town building's low hills, dusted with pale grass, leafless cottonwoods rattling in the wind, and far-off fence lines that seemed to divide nothing from nothing. Her hands had gone numb around the baby's bundle. By the time a small shape rose from the distance, a house standing solitary against the horizon, it was plain and unpainted, boards weathered gray, roof patched in places where tin caught the light. A low barn leaned against it as though the wind had been pushing for years. He helped her down before she could attempt it. Herself, the cold, pressed in sharper without the horse's warmth. Jonas pushed the door open, the hinges groaning, and gestured her inside. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and old coffee grounds. The single room held a stove with a blackened kettle on top, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a bed tucked against the far wall. Everything had the same worn, purposeful look as the man kept up enough to last. But with no wasted effort for comfort, she stood near the stove while he removed his coat, his movements slow and deliberate. The fire inside was low, but the warmth crept toward her fingers in cautious increments. "You can set her there," he said, nodding toward the bed. Margaret shook her head. "She's fine here." He didn't press. Instead, he moved to the stove, stirred the coals, and added a log. The flames caught, sending light and shadow crawling up the walls. For the first time in weeks, she let her shoulders drop an inch. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Inside, there was only the sound of the fire and the quiet shuffle of his boots. She didn't know what he expected from her. She didn't know if this place would be safe for long. But she knew the way he had looked at her in the street, not as a burden, not as a curse, but as a person who deserved to be moved out of harm's way. It was not kindness, exactly. It was something steadier, more like a promise made without words. Margaret had been pulled from one hardship into another unknown, yet for the first time in months. She felt the smallest thread of dignity, fragile as a strand of hair caught in the wind still unbroken. The days settled into a rhythm so quiet it seemed to belong to the land itself. Mornings came gray and cold, the frost clinging to the windows until the stove coaxed it away. Jonas was always outside by first light, his boots sounding against the hard ground, the gate latching behind him. Margaret would rise after, tending to the girls, heating water, setting bread to bake. No one spoke much. His offer had been simple, a bed, food, and shelter in exchange for help around the place. It was not charity, it was not kindness dressed in pity. It was a trade, plain and square, and she accepted it because it gave her something steady too. Put her hands too. Girls learned quickly where they could be. Often, they followed her in a small cluster as she moved through the yard, hanging wet sheets that snapped in the wind or shaking crumbs from a tablecloth. Their eyes were sharp, always watching not just her, but the way Jonas moved across the land, the way he checked the barn door twice, the way he stood with one shoulder toward the wind as if bracing for something unseen. It was in those quiet hours she began to notice the details. The scars across his knuckles pale and old, as if earned from years of work or fights long behind him. The faded outline of a burn along his wrist, hidden when his sleeves were rolled down. And in the evenings, when the light turned copper and he came inside, she saw the way his gaze would drift toward the old rocking chair by the door. It faced outward, toward the yard and the road beyond, as though it had once been a sentinel for someone's return. She never asked who. When the day's work was done, Jonas would sit at the table, eating without fuss, and she would serve him, without ceremony. They were two people sharing a space, bound by an unspoken agreement that words were used only when they were necessary. Still, his silence was not the same as her husband's had been. Her husband's quiet had been a threat. Heavy with what might come if she misstepped, Jonas's was. Different, not warm, not yet. But steady in a way that felt less like a warning and more like a wall built for keeping something out, not in. At night, she would lie awake, the girls breathing softly around her. She would dream of her late husband, his fists, the sour smell of whiskey on his breath, the way his family's eyes had held no surprise when he struck her. In her dreams, those eyes followed her still, cold and sharp, telling her she was worth nothing more than the work she could do. She would wake before the fire had gone to coals, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Sometimes she would find Jonas sitting in the rocking chair even in the middle of the night, hat low over his brow, the rifle leaned within reach. If he noticed her watching, he didn't speak of it. The days passed in that manner, each one much like the last, but never entirely the same. Once, when she was hauling water from the well, she caught him watching her not in the way of a man sizing a woman, but in the way one might watch the horizon for weather. It unsettled her, not because it was unwelcome, but because she couldn't read what lay behind it. In small ways, she began to know his habits. The way he rubbed at his wrists before lifting the kettle. The way he always cut the bread in thick slices, never thin. The way he let the coffee boil longer than it should, as if he liked the bitterness. These were not the grand markers of a man's life, but the small ones, the kind you learned only by living in his shadow long enough to see the shape of it. He never asked about her past, and she never offered it.
Oh.
But sometimes she caught the flicker in his eyes, when her sleeve slipped and revealed the darkened skin still fading from old bruises. He looked, but he did not pity. In a strange way, that was what allowed her to keep standing straight in his presence. Pity had been a kind of cruelty in her life. It asked for your pain without giving anything in return. Jonas gave nothing, but took nothing either. One evening, when the girls had gone to bed and the fire burned low, she lingered at the table after clearing the dishes. He was mending tack by lamplight, the leather spread across his lap. The quiet was deep but not oppressive, she realized. Then that the weight she felt here was not danger, but history. His, hers, and something else they hadn't yet named. Outside, the wind rattled the barn door. Inside, the room held the faint scent of coffee grounds and wood smoke. And she thought not, for the first time, that this was what survival felt like. Not comfort, not ease, but the slow understanding that someone else in the room knew what it was to be left behind, and was willing to keep standing there with you in the quiet. The snow began before dusk, light flakes spinning down out of a pale sky. By nightfall, it was a wall of white sweeping over the land, swallowing fence lines and hiding the distant hills. Margaret kept the girls near the stove, listening to the wind scrape at the walls. Jonas had gone to town that morning, promising to be back by evening, but the hour had long passed. Every time the wind shifted, she thought she heard hooves, only for the sound to vanish into the storm's hollow roar. It was near midnight when the door banged open. Jonas stepped inside, snow crusted in his beard and shoulders, leading a second figure by the arm. The man with him was younger, perhaps in his 20s, wrapped in a blanket stiff with frost. His skin was copper-toned, his dark hair matted with ice, and his steps were unsteady. Jonas guided him toward the fire without a word. Margaret stiffened, her hands still on the kettle. She had heard stories, half warnings, half threats about Apache raids, about women taken and never seen again. The man's eyes flicked to her and away, as if he had no interest in her at all, which unsettled her more than if he had stared. Jonas crouched beside him, unwrapping the blanket and revealing a deep gash along the man's forearm. Blood had frozen along the edge of his sleeve. "Water," Jonas said simply. She hesitated for a fraction of a breath, then fetched the basin. Together they cleaned the wound, Jonas working with the steady hands of someone who had done this before. Man winced, but didn't cry out, his jaw tight. He muttered something in a language Margaret didn't know. The syllables low and rhythmic, like river stones clattering underwater. Jonas answered him in halting English. "Name's Taeon, from the river villages west. Settlers chased him. Said he stole a horse. Says it's his own." Margaret looked toward the door where a shaggy bay stood in the snow, reins looped over the porch rail, its breath fogged in the bitter air. She didn't know if it was his or if the settlers had reason to claim otherwise. But Jonas had brought him here, and that spoke louder than any tale. The storm hammered the shutters through the night. The girls lay curled together on the bed, but Margaret didn't sleep. She kept to her chair, shawl pulled tight, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire. Every so often, she glanced at Taeon, who sat on the floor near the hearth, his eyes half closed, hands resting on his knees. He looked more like a man waiting out a long journey than a threat. By morning, the world outside was gone under white. The storm had settled in, and there would be no travel for days. Jonas came in from the barn with snow caked to his boots and announced they'd be stuck until the drifts let up. The hours blurred. Us were quiet, broken only by the snap of the fire and the occasional murmur between Jonas and Taeon. Margaret caught fragments of trails, of snow depth, of places she had never heard of. The man spoke slowly, as if weighing each word. On the second morning, she found Taeon sitting at the table with a strip of leather between his teeth, his long hair falling forward. His fingers worked deftly, separating the strands and weaving them into a braid. It was not hurried work. Each movement was deliberate, his eyes fixed on the task. She had braided her own hair in the same way as a girl, though never with that kind of care, as if each twist and knot was an act of defiance against the cold and the miles and the eyes of men who would see him as less than they were. Something in her shifted. The fearful story she'd been told felt thin in the presence of a man who could braid his hair with that kind of quiet pride. That night, when Jonas stepped out to bring in more wood, she poured Taeon a cup of coffee. Without being asked, he took it with a nod, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time. Neither spoke. The firelight moved between them, softening the edges of the room, the storm still howling beyond the walls. 3 days they spent like that, caught between the weather and the unspoken distance in the room. The girls grew used to the stranger's presence, even daring to leave their dolls near where he sat. On the third morning, the wind eased, the sun pushing through in pale streaks. When Jonas saddled the horses, Taeon helped without prompting, his movements smooth despite the healing wound. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching them work side by side, the snow bright around them. She thought of how quickly she had tensed when Jonas brought him in, how the shape of his face and the sound of his voice had been enough to rouse old fears planted by other people's words. But storms, she realized, had a way of stripping the world down to its truest form. You learned who a man was when the wind cut through and the fire was all you had. And in that stripped-down place, she saw not the savage she had been warned of, but a man carrying his own storms, meeting hers, without asking for anything in return. The snow broke at last, the sky clearing to a pale, brittle blue that made the drifts glare in the sun. Jonas rode into town for supplies, Tyone keeping to the barn to mend harness straps. When Jonas returned that afternoon, there was less in the wagon than Margaret expected: a sack of flour, coffee, a few root vegetables, nothing more. She noticed how he set the goods down harder than usual, the muscles in his jaw flexing. Later, as they unpacked in the kitchen, he said nothing about the shortage. But she had lived long enough to know when words were being swallowed whole. That evening, while he was outside chopping wood, one of the girls wandered in holding a folded scrap of paper she'd found in the yard. The handwriting was jagged. The message short: "We know who you keep under your roof." Margaret burned it in the stove before the girls could ask. In the days that followed, the air inside the house shifted. Jonas moved with the same quiet purpose as always, but there was a weight in it now. Tyone kept to the barn, working with an intensity that seemed less about the chores and more about staying out of sight. When Margaret went into town for milk, she felt eyes on her back. A woman at the dry goods store asked casually whether Jonas still had that Indian boy on the place. Margaret didn't answer. Supplies ran lower, the meals plainer. Jonas didn't speak of it. But she could see the choices he was making, cutting his own portions short, stretching the flour, working longer hours on less food, what he did not do was send Tayon away. Margaret began to see his silence differently. It was not the silence of a man avoiding conflict. It was the silence of someone who had chosen his ground and meant to stand it without wasting breath. She found herself watching him more closely, tracing the fine lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders stayed squared even when the weight on them grew heavier. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, she stepped outside to find him. In the barn, the lantern light threw long shadows across the packed dirt floor. Jonas sat on an overturned crate, a rifle laid across his knees. His hands moved over it slowly, cloth rubbing the metal smooth, his thumb brushing a spot worn lighter. Then the rest from years of handling. She stood in the doorway, unsure if she was intruding. But he didn't send her away. "Had this rifle near 20 years, he said finally, his voice carrying in the still air. "Bought it the year I married Anna." Margaret moved closer, the cold air clinging to her skin. She waited, not wanting to break whatever had loosened his tongue. "She died in that house," he said, not looking at her. "Childbirth. Baby didn't make it either. That was the last winter before I stopped leaving the place unless I had to." The words were simple, but they landed heavy. She understood now why the rooms in his home felt as though they had been waiting for a voice that would not return. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He nodded once, as if accepting it, but not dwelling on it. Set the rifle aside, the metal catching the lantern glow, and rubbed his hands together. "Don't reckon I was much for talking before, after that." Well, didn't see the point. Margaret thought of her own silences. The ones forced by fear, the ones she had built herself so no one could use her words against her. She thought of how, since arriving here, she had learned the difference between a silence that cages and a silence that guards. Jonas leaned back against the wall, his eyes on the dark beyond the barn door. "They'll talk. We'll keep talking. But I won't put a man out in the cold to make him feel better about themselves." She felt something shift in her chest. Trust was not a thing that sprang up overnight, and hers had been buried deep. But here was a man who kept his word without needing to speak it twice, who would stand in front of another in the face of gossip and threat, even when it cost him. The wind outside had stilled, the world holding its breath in the pause between winter storms. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of oil and wood shavings, the lantern's light painting the edges of his face in gold. Margaret didn't move closer, and neither did he. But she left that night with the quiet knowledge that something inside her had stirred back to life, something she had not dared name in years. And it was not love, not yet, but the first clear sign of where it might one day take root. The smell of smoke woke her. At first she thought it was from the stove, a log burning down to embers. But then she heard the shouts, Jonas's voice low but urgent, Tayan's boots pounding across the yard. She was on her feet before her. Mind had caught up, the cold floor biting through her stockings. When she threw open the door, the night hit her like a wall. The air was sharp with frost, but the wind carried the hot, acrid sting of burning hay. The barn's western wall flickered, orange shadows jerking across the snow. Jonas was already there, bucket in hand, Tayan beside him. Without thinking, she ran to the pump. The water was ice at her wrists, numbing her fingers as she worked the handle. She filled the bucket, stumbled toward the barn, and passed it too. Jonas, his hands closed over it with a force that nearly unbalanced her. He didn't speak, didn't pause, just turned and threw the water against the flames. They worked like that. A rhythm between them, she at the pump, him and Tayan at the fire. Each trip left her skirts heavier, her breath sharper in her chest. Sparks hissed and snapped as steam rose in white plumes, the scent of wet wood mixing with the bitter temps of char. Somewhere in the dark a horse screamed and kicked its stall by. The time the flames were beaten down to smolder, her palms were raw and stinging, the wool of her shawl clinging damp to her arms. She bent to catch her breath, the fire's glow painting the snow in shifting shades of gold and black. Jonas straightened from where he'd been dousing the last embers, his chest rising and falling like a man who'd been holding himself still for too long. It was then that her shawl slipped from her shoulder, falling enough to bare the edge of her upper arm. The old bruises were faint now, no longer purple, but a deep yellow-brown. The ghost of something that had been far worse. Jonas's eyes caught on it. For a moment, the fire's light made them seem darker, sharper. Then something changed. In his face, not pity, not the hollow look people gave when they didn't know what to say. It was something steadier, almost like recognition. "You all right?" he asked, his voice lower than the crackle of the coals. She nodded, adjusting. "The shawl? I'm fine." He didn't look away. The words were rough, as if they'd been taken from a place in him that didn't open easily. She blinked, realizing she had never heard him thank anyone in all the time she'd been there. Not because he was ungrateful, but because he was a man who measured his words like grain in a scarce winter. They walked back to the house in silence, the snow crunching under their boots. Inside, she stoked the stove and set the kettle on, her hands still aching. He stood a few feet away, rubbing his sleeve over his damp hair, steam curling from it in the warmth. The girls had slept through it all, their soft breathing rising from the bed. Tayan remained in the yard, checking the barn for stray embers. The quiet was thick, but it was not the cold kind. Margaret sat near the stove, letting the heat seep into her bones. Her fingers found the end of her braidless hair, the strands loose around her shoulders. She hadn't braided it since her husband died. It had been a small, stubborn refusal, as if leaving it unbound would keep the past from catching hold of her again. But now, with the scent of smoke still in the air and the memory of Jonas's eyes on her lingering, she pulled the hair over one shoulder. Slowly she began to weave it. Her fingers moved without hurry, each twist deliberate, as if reclaiming something she had been denied. Jonas watched from where he stood. She felt it without seeing, the stillness in him, the way he seemed to notice things without speaking them aloud. When she tied off the braid, she glanced up. His gaze shifted just as hers met it. He looked away quickly, reaching for his coat, but not before she caught the faint warmth in his expression. It was the smallest thing, and yet it was more than she had expected from him. The fire outside had been meant as a warning, a threat from people who wanted to scare them into bending. But standing there in the quiet afterward, with the stove crackling and the braid lying heavy against her shoulder, she understood that not all fires were meant to destroy. Some burned slow and steady, giving off a heat you didn't notice at first until you realized you'd been leaning toward it all along. The news came before dawn, carried by a neighbor who kept his distance at the door. His breath fogged in the cold as he told Jonas that the men who had set the barn alight weren't finished. They were coming back, maybe tonight, maybe sooner, to make sure their message was heard. Jonas didn't waste words. He closed the door, set the latch, and moved with steady purpose toward the corner where his rifle rested. Margaret watched him check the chamber, his hands sure and practiced. Then he pulled on his coat, reached for the saddle blanket, and began working in the silent efficiency of someone who had decided what needed doing long before it was spoken. She thought he meant to meet them here, to wait for the fight. But when the horses were ready, he came back inside and told her to get the girls dressed. "We're riding to town," he said, his tone even but unyielding. The wind cut hard as they set out. The snow underfoot packed into glassy crusts that crunched beneath the horses' hooves. Margaret rode behind him, the youngest girl bundled in her lap, the older two clinging to Tyone. The sky was a flat, cold gray, the kind that made every sound carry farther. When they reached the main street, word had already spread. People gathered. Outside the store, the saloon, the blacksmith's shop, drawn by curiosity as much as by trouble, the three men responsible for the fire stood together, their faces drawn into smirks that didn't quite reach their eyes. Jonas rode forward until his horse stood square in the center of the road. Margaret felt every gaze turned toward her, the weight of it pressing like a hand against her spine. She kept her chin level. He dismounted, motioning for her to do the same. When she stood beside him, the girls close to her skirts, he faced the crowd. His voice carried without shouting. "This woman and her daughters live under my roof," he said. "That makes them under my name and my protection." The words were plain, without the heat of a man looking for a fight. But there was something in them, in the way they left no space for doubt, that made even the ones who disliked him shift where they stood. One of the fire-setters spat into the snow. "Ain't no one telling you who to keep, Cutter. Just don't expect the rest of us to." Jonas stepped forward once. It's not closing the space entirely, but enough to make the man's words falter. "You've said your piece," he replied, "and I've said mine. That's the end of it." The silence that followed was sharper than the wind. No one moved. No one wanted to be the one to test how far he would go. Eventually, one of the men muttered something under his breath and turned away. The others followed, their retreat slow, but certain. Margaret hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until the sound of the crowd shifting broke the spell. Jonas didn't linger. He turned, lifted the girls back onto the horses, and helped her into the saddle. Taeon swung up beside them, his face unreadable, but his shoulders easier than they had been in weeks. They left without looking back. The ride home was quiet, except for the wind, which had picked up again, pulling at scarves and hoods. Margaret kept her eyes on Jonas's back as he rode ahead, his posture straight, the line of his coat rippling in the gusts. Something in that steadiness worked into her like heat after a long freeze. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun had broken. Weakly through the clouds, casting long bands of light over the snow, the house looked the same as it had the day she arrived, weathered boards. The old barn, smoke curling from the chimney, but it no longer felt like a place she was passing through. Inside, Jonas stowed the rifle and hung his coat without comment. The girls settled near the stove, chattering in low voices, their fear spent in the cold air on the way home. Taeon went to check the barn again, just to be certain. Margaret lingered in the doorway, watching Jonas pour himself a cup of coffee. He handed it to her, without asking if she wanted it, as if he knew she did. She took it, her fingers brushing his briefly, not enough to be called a touch, but enough for her to feel the roughness of his skin and the warmth beneath it. It struck her then that they had both been carrying ghosts, different in shape, but the same in weight. And now, without ever speaking it aloud, they had chosen to face the living world side by side. The wind rattled the shutters, but the sound no longer felt like a warning. It was simply the wind, moving over a house that had held against worse. She sipped the coffee, the bitter heat filling her chest. and thought of how far she had come from the street where he had found her, bruised and alone. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, she believed it was worth walking or riding toward. Jonas glanced at her then, not with the guarded look he so often wore, but with something quieter, something that settled between them like a promise neither of them was in a hurry to break. And though nothing was said, Margaret knew. The ranch was no longer a stranger's land. It was the first place in a long time where she might set down roots and trust. They would not be torn up again.